Censors have always tried to control what we see, but Grindhouse cinema didn't just ignore them, it laughed in their faces. These weren't polished Hollywood blockbusters with safety nets. They were raw, dangerous, and impossible to tame. What happens when filmmakers decide the rules don't apply to them? You get chaos, outrage, and sometimes brilliance. Let's dive into the wild world of Grindhouse classics that told the censors to get lost, one bloody reel at a time. Blood Feast, 1963. If Grindhouse Films had a founding father, his name would be Herschel Gordon Lewis, and his weapon of choice was a bucket of stage blood. Blood Feast didn't just push boundaries, it bulldozed them into oblivion. On the surface, it's a story about an Egyptian caterer in Miami who butchers women to prepare a ritual feast for an ancient goddess. Sounds absurd, right? That's because it was. But Lewis wasn't aiming for realism. He was aiming for shock. Audiences in 1963 had never seen anything like it. Limbs hacked off, guts spilling out, and that infamous tongue removal scene, it was a gut punch to a movie-going public still used to black and white thrillers. Made for around $24,000, the film looked cheap, and the acting could barely pass for high school theater. But that didn't matter. It was the first feature-length gore film in color, and that alone was enough to make history. The censors panicked. Some cities banned it outright, while others demanded heavy cuts. Drive-ins marketed it as nothing so appalling in the history of motion pictures, which of course made people want to see it even more. Teenagers dared each other to sit through it without running out of the theater. Reportedly, more than a few people fainted or vomited during screenings. The genius of Blood Feast wasn't quality, it was audacity. Lewis gave the world its first true splatter movie, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Every slash, every gush of red paint-like blood was a middle finger to polite cinema. Without this little Grindhouse curiosity, there would be no Friday the 13th, no Evil Dead, no slasher boom. It's not just a cult classic, it's patient zero for every gory nightmare that followed. Faster, Pussycat, kill, kill. 1965. Before superheroes dominated screens, Russ Meyer gave us 3 women in go-go boots who could outfight, outdrive, and outscheme any man foolish enough to cross them. Faster, Pussycat, kill, kill is a black-and-white desert rampage that made censors break out in cold sweats. Why? Because it flipped every expectation. Instead of fragile damsels, we got Tura Satana as Varla, a leather-clad powerhouse who exuded menace with every glare and kick. The film follows Varla and her 2 partners as they race through the desert, drag racing, brawling, and tearing through a landscape of weak men and easy victims. They kidnap, manipulate, and fight their way into the lives of a strange family hiding a fortune. It's pulpy, it's raw, and it doesn't care about being respectable. Meyer shot it fast and cheap, but the energy leaps off the screen like a wild animal. Censors hated it for obvious reasons. Female characters weren't supposed to be this dominant, this violent, or this unashamedly in control. Reviewers at the time called it smut, garbage, or worse. But in Grindhouse theaters, it played like a revolution. Audiences cheered Satana's ferocity, and the film slowly grew into an underground legend. Decades later, it was hailed as ahead of its time, inspiring directors from John Waters to Quentin Tarantino. What makes Faster, Pussycat still feel dangerous today is its energy. Every frame vibrates with tension, every line feels like a challenge, and every fight is staged like a showdown in a fever dream. It wasn't just telling a story, it was throwing down a gauntlet. Censors could cut, ban, or sneer all they wanted, but Meyer had already planted the seed of a Grindhouse classic. To this day, no one has matched Tura Satana's blend of charisma and intimidation. If Blood Feast birthed gore, Faster, Pussycat birthed attitude, and that's why it's essential Grindhouse history. I'd Drink Your Blood 1970. Imagine a cult of devil-worshipping drifters tripping on acid, terrorizing a small town. Now imagine those same drifters accidentally eating meat pies laced with rabid dog blood. That's I Drink Your Blood in a nutshell, and it's every bit as insane as it sounds. This wasn't just exploitation, it was exploitation with a rabid snarl, and the censors had no clue what to do with it. The setup is simple. A young boy wants revenge on the cult for hurting his family, so he injects dog blood into meat pies and tricks them into eating it. Soon the entire group is frothing, foaming, and going berserk. What follows is chaos, machete attacks, bloody rampages, and wide-eyed performances that feel like they were ripped from an actual fever dream. The film promised, guaranteed to upset your stomach, and boy, it delivered. Censors were horrified. I Drink Your Blood became one of the first films slapped with an X rating purely for violence, not for anything else. Entire states demanded cuts. Some theaters showed it edited down to half its length, and yet audiences couldn't get enough. Drive-ins promoted it with sickly slogans and double-billed it with other shocking titles, creating legendary nights of cinematic mayhem. The film didn't bother with logic, it was about sensation. From the wild-eyed cult leader to the grotesque rampages through abandoned houses, every scene dared the audience to keep watching. Some fainted, some puked, but many came back for more. It was Grindhouse cinema at its purest, chaotic, confrontational, and absolutely unrepentant. By the time the credits rolled, Censors had lost, and a cult classic had been born. The Last House on the Left, 1972. When Wes Craven unleashed his debut feature, nobody was ready. The Last House on the Left was marketed with the infamous tagline, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie." But for Censors, it wasn't only a movie, it was a full-blown nightmare. The story follows two teenage girls who head into the city for a concert, only to be kidnapped and brutalized by a gang of criminals. The horror escalates until the gang makes the fatal mistake of hiding out at one of the girls' homes, where her parents discover the truth and unleash their own brand of revenge. What makes this film unbearable, even today, is the rawness. Craven shot it in a grimy, documentary-like style that made everything feel horribly real. Censors across the world were shaken. Some countries banned it outright, others demanded heavy edits. Even in the U.S., it played in cut-down versions depending on where you lived. Audiences were split. Some stormed out in disgust, while others whispered that they had never seen anything so bold. The violence was shocking, yes, but the film's real sting came from its uncomfortable realism. It didn't feel like escapism. It felt like something you could stumble across in the news. Over time, critics and filmmakers reevaluated it, recognizing Craven's film as both brutal exploitation and an unflinching statement on violence in America. Still, nothing could erase the outrage it sparked in 1972. For censors, it was a direct challenge. For audiences, it was a dare. And for Grindhouse history, it was a turning point that proved horror could be both raw entertainment and social gut punch at the same time. The Big Bird Cage, 1972. When director Jack Hill teamed up with Pam Grier and Sid Haig, the result was pure Grindhouse dynamite. The Big Bird Cage wasn't just another women in prison film, it was a wild, sweaty, jungle-set rebellion that drove censors up the wall. With sadistic guards, corrupt officials, and inmates plotting violent escapes, it gave audiences exactly what they came for: danger, chaos, and unrelenting attitude. Pam Grier was the centerpiece. As an inmate who doesn't back down from anyone, she radiated strength and charisma, instantly cementing herself as a Grindhouse queen. Sid Haig played the revolutionary leader with his usual manic energy, and together they created sparks on screen. The plot was simple. Rebels infiltrate a prison camp to stir up chaos, and chaos is exactly what they deliver. Censors despise the entire women in prison trend, but the Big Bird Cage in particular became a lightning rod. Too violent, too bold, too unapologetic. In many regions it was chopped up beyond recognition, and in others banned outright. But for audiences, especially at the drive-in circuit, it was electric. People cheered during the brawls, laughed at the outrageous dialogue, and reveled in seeing characters fight back against corrupt power. What separated this film from countless knockoffs was Jack Hill's knack for energy and pace. Every scene had a snap to it, every character had a spark, and Greer's presence elevated the whole thing beyond cheap sleaze. Sure, it was exploitation, but it was exploitation with style. The censors tried to cage it, but like the inmates in the film, the big bird cage just smashed through the bars. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. If there's one Grindhouse film that terrified not just audiences, but also the authorities, it's Cannibal Holocaust. Ruggero Deodato's Jungle Nightmare was so convincing that Italian police literally arrested him for murder. That's right, the censors thought he had made a snuff film, and honestly, watching it, you can see why they freaked out. The movie is framed as a found-footage story about a documentary crew lost in the Amazon. When their footage is recovered, it reveals unimaginable atrocities. The images are raw, tribal rituals, gruesome violence, and scenes that still feel uncomfortably real. The impact was so strong that Deodato had to bring his actors into court to prove they were alive. Few films in history can say they caused that kind of legal chaos. But censorship wasn't just about the courtroom. The film was banned in over 50 countries, including the UK, Australia, and Germany. In the U.S., it was circulated mostly through bootlegs and midnight screenings, where Grindhouse audiences devoured it like contraband. For the censors, it was the ultimate nightmare, a film that blurred the line between fiction and reality so well that banning it only made people want to see it more. Here's the kicker. Beyond the gore and controversy, Cannibal Holocaust had a point. It questioned Western exploitation of primitive cultures, turning the camera back on so-called civilized filmmakers. Love it or hate it, it was a gut punch of both horror and commentary. Grindhouse thrived on shock, and this film didn't just tell the censors to get lost. It tied them up, dragged them into the jungle, and dared them to look away. Rolling Thunder, 1977. While most revenge films of the era reveled in cathartic violence, Rolling Thunder was different. It was cold, deliberate, and unflinchingly brutal. Written by Paul Schrader, who also wrote Taxi Driver, the film told the story of Major Charles Rain, a Vietnam vet returning home to Texas. Instead of a hero's welcome, he finds his family murdered in a home invasion. From there, Rane plots revenge with the kind of icy precision that rattled both audiences and censors. The violence wasn't cartoonish, it was unsettlingly real. Rane's slow, methodical approach made every act of vengeance feel like a funeral march. The most infamous moment? His hand being mangled in a garbage disposal, followed by his transformation into a human weapon fitted with a prosthetic hook. This wasn't Grindhouse fun, it was Grindhouse trauma, and it hit like a brick. Censors loathed it. Some theaters refused to screen it. Others demanded edits to tone down the violence. But in the Grindhouse circuit, it thrived, celebrated as one of the purest revenge thrillers ever made. Audiences didn't just watch, they sat in stunned silence, then erupted when justice was finally delivered. The film didn't make a fortune, but its reputation only grew. Tarantino famously called it a masterpiece, and you can see its fingerprints on countless modern revenge flicks. For the censors, Rolling Thunder was too grim, too violent, too much. For Grindhouse fans, it was exactly what they wanted, a story where vengeance wasn't just hot-blooded, it was ice-cold. Miss 45, 1981. Abel Ferrara's Ms. 45 didn't roar onto screens with flashy gore or jungle mayhem, it whispered, then exploded. At its core is Zoe Lund as Thana, a mute seamstress in New York who, after enduring brutal trauma, transforms into a vigilante prowling the streets. She doesn't speak a word, but her presence commands the screen. In a city rotting with menace, she becomes both avenger and executioner. What set Ms. 45 apart was its quiet intensity. Ferrara's New York wasn't glamorized. It was a concrete hellscape, a place where danger lingered around every corner. As Thana stalks through alleys with her .45 pistol, the film turns into a fever dream of urban dread. The climax, with Thana donning a nun's habit at a Halloween party before unleashing her wrath, is one of the most iconic scenes in Grindhouse history. Censors didn't know what to make of it. The violence was raw, but it wasn't glorified. It was messy, ugly, and pointed. Some countries banned it, others hacked it apart. But none of that stopped it from gaining a loyal following. Grindhouse audiences recognized it as something special, not just another revenge flick, but a psychological portrait of power, trauma, and transformation. Zoe Lund's performance sealed its legacy. Her silence spoke louder than dialogue ever could. Every glance, every move carried weight. By the time the credits rolled, she had become a symbol, not of victimhood, but of unrestrained defiance. Miss 45 didn't just flip off the censors, it silenced them completely, proving that Grindhouse could be as thoughtful as it was brutal. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Few films have been as misunderstood, feared, and censored as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Tobe Hooper's nightmare of rural cannibals became infamous as one of the bloodiest films ever made. Except it wasn't. In reality, it's surprisingly restrained on gore. The horror comes not from buckets of blood, but from unbearable tension, relentless sound design, and the sheer madness of Leatherface charging at you with a chainsaw. The story is deceptively simple. A group of friends takes a road trip through Texas and stumbles into the wrong house, a house filled with bones, meat hooks, and a family of killers. From the first clang of a metal door, it feels less like a movie and more like a nightmare someone smuggled onto film reels. Shot on a shoestring budget in sweltering heat, the cast endured genuine misery, which bled through onto the screen. Censors worldwide recoiled. Britain banned it for decades. Australia pulled it from theaters. Even in America, local boards demanded cuts or simply refused to show it. Yet the ban only added to its myth. Whisper campaigns spread about the scariest film ever made, and audiences flocked to prove their courage. The brilliance of Chainsaw lies in what it suggests. You rarely see the blade meet flesh, but the editing and sound trick your mind into filling in the blanks. By the time the infamous dinner scene arrives, with Leatherface's family shrieking and tormenting the lone survivor, the audience feels like they've been kidnapped too. Hooper gave the world a raw, unflinching descent into madness, and no censor could stop it from becoming legend. It's not just a Grindhouse classic, it's one of the most important horror films ever made. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. If Grindhouse cinema ever had a film that seemed engineered to horrify censors, it was Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS. Diane Thorne's portrayal of Ilsa, a sadistic camp commander, shocked audiences with its unflinching imagery, controversial themes, and relentless parade of excess. Released by a Canadian producer but aimed squarely at the American Grindhouse circuit, it became notorious almost overnight. The story was outrageous, but the presentation was even more so. Ilsa dominates her prisoners, schemes for power, and drives the plot with an intensity few had seen from a female villain at the time. Thorne's performance was both commanding and terrifying, turning Ilsa into a cult icon. Censors absolutely lost it. The Nazi imagery alone guaranteed bans in multiple countries, while the violence and disturbing set pieces pushed it over the edge. The film was outright banned in the UK for decades, and many American theaters refused to screen it. But for Grindhouse audiences, that only added fuel to the fire. Bootlegs circulated widely, and sequels followed, each pushing the envelope in different settings, from Siberia to harems. What made Ilsa stand out wasn't subtlety, it was audacity. The filmmakers knew exactly what they were doing, daring censors to shut them down, daring audiences to look away. They turned taboo into a selling point, and it worked. To this day, Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, remains one of the most infamous exploitation films of all time, a movie that lived and thrived precisely because censors tried to bury it. Street Trash, 1987. By the late 1980s, Grindhouse theaters were dying out, but Street Trash showed the spirit was still alive and as disgusting as ever. The premise alone is bonkers. A batch of cheap liquor called Tenafly Viper gets dumped in a liquor store, and whoever drinks it literally melts into Technicolor goo. That's right, no haunted houses, no chainsaw killers, just toxic booze that turns people into puddles. The effects were so outrageous they looked like someone blended horror with a Saturday morning cartoon, except censors weren't laughing. The sheer grotesqueness of the melting scenes sparked outrage. Limbs dripped, faces slid off skulls, and one unlucky drinker dissolved right on a toilet seat. Audiences gagged, cheered, and howled in equal measure, and theaters either cut it to ribbons or banned it outright. But Street Trash wasn't just gore for gore's sake. Beneath the splatter was a nasty satire of urban decay, homelessness, and a society that treated people like garbage. Director J. Michael Muro, who later became a respected cinematographer, shot it with a mix of grime and comic book flair. Grindhouse fans recognized it as a late-stage classic, over the top, yes, but with a streak of dark humor that made it unforgettable. Censors tried to treat it like toxic waste, but audiences knew better. Street Trash proved that even when the Grindhouse era was on life support, its ability to shock and offend was alive and kicking and oozing all over the screen. The Warriors, 1979. Unlike many Grindhouse classics, The Warriors wasn't drenched in gore. It was drenched in style. Walter Hill's film followed a New York street gang framed for murder, forced to battle their way back home through rival gangs across the city. Baseball furies with bats, roller skating assassins, leather-vested thugs. It was like a comic book brought to life, with a pounding synth. Soundtrack to match. But the censors? They weren't worried about fake blood. They were worried about real blood. The film hit theaters at a time when gang violence in American cities was already on the rise. After incidents of vandalism and fights broke out at screenings, some theaters pulled it, and newspapers blamed the film for encouraging chaos. It wasn't the first time cinema was accused of corrupting the youth, but it was one of the loudest controversies of the late 70s. The irony? The film was never about glorifying gangs. It was about survival, loyalty, and the absurd theater of urban warfare. But censors, police, and worried parents saw the costumes and the violence and panicked. Paramount even pulled back its advertising, terrified of further backlash. Despite the fear, The Warriors survived the firestorm and grew into one of the most beloved cult films of all time. Its costumes, slang, and iconic line, "Can you dig it?" became cultural staples. Censors tried to turn it into a scapegoat, but instead they handed it a permanent place in the Grindhouse Hall of Fame. Grindhouse cinema never asked for permission, and these films prove it. From chainsaw maniacs to melting drunks, from Pam Grier's firepower to Tura Satana's fists, they pushed boundaries until the censors lost their minds. And yet, decades later, these same movies are remembered as icons, not mistakes. So what do you think? Did the censors ever stand a chance? Or were these films destined to break free? Drop your thoughts below and keep the grind alive.